There are many games within the Final Fantasy franchise that have built their own legacies apart from the series. Final Fantasy VI is famous for having pushed the limits of what storytelling can do through a video game medium. Final Fantasy VII is famous for its quantum leap forward in terms of technological achievement, and 10 is famous for how a compelling romance story can be told through a video game without sacrificing plot tension and world building. Now, whether you have these same appreciations for the games depends entirely on you, but there's no denying that these legacies shine brightly when thinking about the franchise as a whole. While I just named arguably the three most popular examples from the series, the monumental games within the series certainly aren't limited to these three. The solidarity of the community, to the extent that there is solidarity, comes from the fact that many people who may be die-hard fans of Final Fantasy IV have also played Final Fantasy X, and 13, and most of the other games for that matter. Many Final Fantasy fans have played many Final Fantasy games. That isn't unique to the Final Fantasy fanbase, but it is no less true of the fanbase. As with any long-running series, the Final Fantasy series has, well, black sheep. The two undeniable black sheep of the Final Fantasy family are the MMOs, 11 and 14. With the prolific success of Final Fantasy XIV, both in terms of its commercial success and in terms of its critical success, many fans welcome this entry into the mainline franchise, and that is generally the end of the story. Final Fantasy is a great franchise with some questionable games and two misfits. But one of the misfits is great. Should that really be the end of the story, though? Final Fantasy XI, just like every other entry in the series, has its own legacy, and its community is just as passionate, if not more so, than any other Final Fantasy community. So, why is it so often overlooked when considering the main series entries? To answer these questions, I'll only be reviewing the original story content of Final Fantasy XI as it is at the time of making this video. This is for a couple reasons. The first is because it is the roughest part of the game, and if this part still stands the test of time, certainly every other piece of content does too. Admittedly, the second reason is because the original story content is the only content I've had the opportunity to play through. While I would love to do a review on the whole experience, my schedule simply won't permit it. But my opinions of the original story content, I felt, are still more than worth talking about. I'm going to be frank with you. I am not an authority on Final Fantasy XI development, and I also think talking about the development cycle isn't as relevant to the questions we're trying to answer as many of the other topics we could spend time discussing. But it does have some importance, and that is primarily to give these questions context. For this, we need to look less at the development cycle of Final Fantasy XI, and more so at the way the game has developed over the years. If you spent any time at all looking at this title before, you will already be familiar with how punishing this game used to be, particularly on those who wanted to pretend this game wasn't an MMO. After around level 10, it was, practically speaking, impossible to do anything without social interaction and joining a party. It also took forever to do anything from leveling to traveling. The game forged a community through its difficulty. In addition to this, the game did not even remotely care about the player's time. Only the players who dedicated every moment of their free time to this game would actually be able to succeed. There were no conveniences or shortcuts. It was either you played it by its own rules, or you didn't play it at all. The game was structured this way to facilitate two things: an in-game community and a feeling of accomplishment. While this certainly had its benefits and detriments, the individuals that resonated deeply with this punishing experience had far less in common with the rest of the Final Fantasy community than did the fanbase of any other Final Fantasy game. The Final Fantasy XI community loved what is now considered the old-school MMO experience, which is something that no one else in this existing Final Fantasy community deeply loved, simply because there had not been an MMO within the series. This isn't to say that the Final Fantasy XI fanbase, and the Final Fantasy franchise fanbase for that matter, are mutually exclusive, because they aren't. But there is no denying that for a series that experienced a lot of change over the years, no mainline entry had come close to deviating from the original game as much as Final Fantasy XI. This is just the beginning of the development story though. After all, the game has 20 years of changes that we need to quickly glance over. Since the game's launch and over its 20-year life cycle, which, yes, that means the game is almost as old as I am, the developers have changed it significantly. The game at launch required social interaction, and everything took a long time. Fast travel was very difficult, and walking everywhere took hours, and you couldn't even start that trip until you had a party because literally everything could kill you in this game. Well, maybe not everything, but almost everything. But that isn't how the game is now due to the changes I've mentioned before. Many of these changes can be summed up in quality of life changes, but the Final Fantasy XI community doesn't see it that way. It is not uncommon to find a Final Fantasy XI fan who says that the changes that have been made to the game were ultimately for the game's worsening. This sentiment speaks so well to the differences between the average Final Fantasy fan and the average XI fan. What were these changes exactly? To name a couple off quickly, they've added summonable mounts, teleportation options all around the world, different sources of experience, extra currencies that allow for easier gear upgrades, and most notably in my opinion, alter egos. Alter egos are NPCs, by the way, that you can summon at any time to form your own party, removing the need of other players. Similarly, summonable mounts gave the player the capacity to do, well, as it sounds, summon a mount anywhere in the game world. This granted them safety to explore on their own because enemies won't attack you while you're on a mount. If you hear these things and think, why would anyone be upset by that? The reason the community mourns these changes aren't because they dislike the things they've gained, but rather because of the things they've lost as a consequence of these changes. Here's an example of what a veteran player appreciated about the game. To be able to even see one of the endgame zones of the game's second expansion, Chains of Promathia, hundreds and hundreds of hours were required looking for parties and backtracking through the zones. Because de-leveling was an actual system in this game, every level gained was a monumental achievement, but an achievement you could lose at any time. Players were required to spend dozens of hours getting to leveling zones, more hours grinding, more hours farming guild for gear, and more hours going through extremely difficult story missions. But after all of those hours, the players who dedicated themselves to playing through Chains of Promathia rewarded with one of the most beautiful zones in the game. The feeling of elation that such an accomplishment gives is truly unmatched in any other video game experience. To top all of this off, players who had the gear and the setups to verify their accomplishments were seen as legends on their respective servers. This is precisely why Final Fantasy XI still has a strong following, because no other game produced such euphoria. But if the reward for sticking to it was great, the price too was great. Because of all of the hundreds of hours required, this price was one that many Final Fantasy fans simply couldn't afford. Now, reevaluating those changes, you can see why 11 fans would be so apprehensive about them. All of the accomplishments that they worked so hard to achieve were now far easier. And as for the feeling of immense euphoria and accomplishment, that too was now restricted to only the very hardest content in the game, rather than being a feeling associated with every accomplishment. So that too was practically gone. This has caused some 11 players to start playing on private servers, which still preserve the game world as it was in the Golden Era. But even these private servers can't possibly recreate the thriving community that the game had built with this difficulty. But with every loss the veteran players went through, the game became more accessible to a wider audience. The game is now very approachable. and usually does a good job at respecting your time. As a consequence, many players such as myself have had the opportunity to try the game and enjoy its content. But this doesn't change the reputation that the game had built for itself over the time of its golden era. Many Final Fantasy players still think of 11, its time demands and forced MMO gameplay, and dismiss it from the main series because of how different it was from the rest of the games. But the past is behind us. Does it have the narrative and gameplay befitting of a Final Fantasy title? Is Final Fantasy XI an actual Final Fantasy game worth playing? Now for the actual game, Final Fantasy XI. I would like to start by examining how the game does in the most important role for every Final Fantasy game, the story. So how is Final Fantasy XI's story? Well, its story is the very reason why it's a mainline entry to begin with. When Sakaguchi himself saw the strength of the narrative being written for the game, he was the one who pushed for this to be a mainline entry. I'll be honest, I really don't see why he pushed for this though. Let me point out that this review is for the original story content of the game. That is missions 1-1 through 5-2. So I don't have the best handle on the complete Final Fantasy XI story, but it is the story content that most players will be starting the game experiencing. From what I understand, each expansion does a remarkable job at telling a gripping plot, expanding the world and the lore, and developing a set of likable characters. From what I've heard from the community, even the worst expansion is still an improvement on the original story. But how is that original story? How does it compare to the rest of the series? I played through the Sandoria missions, so that is the story that I'll largely be referring to. The plot begins 20 years after a war had broken out in Vana'diel, which is the setting of this game, between the Enlightened races and the Beastmen. You start out as an adventurer who finds work for one of the three major nations within Vana'diel. These nations are Bastok, Windurst, and, in my case, Sandoria. At first, the story is really unremarkable. The adventurer started taking on missions from the city guards, and these missions had very little story content to them. While there were some cutscenes, they weren't long or overly notable, and the missions you go on are clearly not missions befitting of a renowned warrior. They're little more than fetch quests, dangerous fetch quests, but fetch quests nonetheless. The story goes through great lengths at demonstrating you aren't much more than an average individual within the world. The guards were mildly impressed with the adventurer's capacity to accomplish the tasks they give him. They continued to give him a series of mundane quests, but these quests were escalating in terms of their intricacy and importance. Eventually, the royal family and the temple knights take note of your capabilities, but not too much note. It is only through hard work and perseverance that you're able to actually get things done to a quality that gets you noticed. The adventurer isn't some prophesied warrior of light or a chosen one from birth. The adventurer is just a good person, working hard to better the world that he finds himself in, and that's it. As far as the supporting characters, many of them are children of the King of Sandoria, King Destin. He has 3 children. First we have Tryon, the eldest son, who has a strong sense of honor and purpose. Tryon is a commander within the Royal Knights, which is the chivalry that works directly under King Destin's command. We also have Tryon's younger brother, Piaget. While there is one more child, she isn't relevant to the original story content. Another character worth note is Kurilla V. Mekru, who is a leader within the ranks of the Temple Knights. The game's narrative uses these 3 characters as representations of the various virtues and vices related to the story's themes, and their interactions wind up driving the main plot. It is as a consequence of a lack of coordination between these 3 that leads Vana'diel to fall into peril during the second half of the story. While I haven't played through many of the other nation missions, and I don't know anything about the respective characters, I've been told that Sandoria actually has the least interesting cast of characters from the original story content, which is a good sign for players who want to start somewhere other than Sandoria because I thought these characters were actually quite good. Eventually, the adventurer is sent to the other nation to assess how their conflicts are treating them, and by chance, you happen upon a revelation that sends Sandoria into shock. I don't want to spoil what exactly this discovery is, because it is one of the only enjoyable things about the core story, so you should experience that for yourself. While I can't say that the development of this story arc is on par with most of the Golden Era Final Fantasy games, it is certainly far more intricate and thematically provocative than many would have you believe. It is quite good, in my opinion, a little slow, but good. And it certainly has that special charm that is characteristic of the series as a whole. One thing that is very well done was the development of the races in the game. There are 5 enlightened races of Vana'diel, each of which are cursed with a sin. The Humes are the human race of this world, and they suffer from apathy. The Elvan are the elves, who suffer from pride. The Tarutaru, which are this game's versions of the Lalafell from 14, just less annoying and much less jarring to look at. They suffer from cowardice. The Galka are a male-only race that reproduces through reincarnation, and their sin is rage. Finally, the Envious Mithra, which I really don't like to talk about, so don't ask. The story takes these different vices and explores how they lead to the decay of the broader world. The apathy of the Humes is what facilitates the emergence of the primary villain. The cowardice of the Tarutaru is what allows the primary conflict of this main story, and the arrogance of the Elvan is what keeps the conflict from being resolved right away. These sins don't just affect the main conflict, by the way, they also affect the way the adventurer is treated throughout the story. A good example of this is when the adventurer meets the King of Sandoria for the first time. This is still earlier on, when you have been relegated to accomplish fancy busy work for the nation. The king isn't overly interested, but is somewhat grateful to this lowly adventurer for helping them out. He is kind, but mildly dismissive upon first meeting. But his dismissive attitude would make sense. He is, after all, an Elvan, cursed with the sin of arrogance. You are a lowly adventurer. However, upon the second meeting, after you have been able to save Vana'diel from another crystal war with the help of others, the king is much more excited to meet you. This is reflected in the additional attention he gives you, but you also quickly realize that he doesn't even remember you from before. He says it is nice to meet you, despite the fact that you have already met. This was an incredibly subtle and, in my opinion, well-executed way to show the player that the Elvan are truly cursed with arrogance. While this certainly isn't their fate, as demonstrated by characters such as Prince Tryon, it is their tendency. Another thing that I couldn't help but mention is the charm that Vana'diel has through its plot. This world feels like a place that actually exists, as though the people in each of the cities are actually affected by the conflict. Every city had a strong sense of identity that really gave the world of Vana'diel a personality, and the story a true sense of gravity. The setting of Vana'diel has quickly become one of my favorites in the series, and for good reason. After finishing the original story of 11, I was impressed at how much thematic execution is present here. But is it worth playing for those who have already completed the other games in the series? Well, maybe not. The story isn't very long, there is little to no character development outside of the main villain, and the pacing was really all over the place. 11's original story isn't anything to write home about. But upon reflection, I can't help but utterly appreciate the thematic execution and the setting of Vana'diel. It was done in a way that few other mainline games could do. So whether or not it is deserving of a mainline moniker, that will be entirely up to each individual to decide for themselves. So why spend so much time talking about the story if it may or may not hold up to the Final Fantasy standard? Well, the fact that this matter is a toss-up is exactly my point. The very worst aspect of this game's story is a strong contender for the mainline series moniker, and if every other story is significantly better, then there is no denying that the whole story of 11, from the Nation missions to the Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, is certainly deserving of the praise it gets from its fans. As I've mentioned before, I haven't played past the original story content, so I can't speak to the quality. But in my attempts to make this video review as comprehensive as it can be for prospective players of the game, I conducted lengthy discussions with people who've played the game extensively. From almost all the players that I've talked to regarding this game's whole story came unanimous praise of the narrative that was crafted for the world of Vana'diel. While some certainly liked it more than others, everyone who played through it and didn't skip the story content all agree that the quality of this game's story, as a whole, does not deviate from the quality present in the rest of the series. As a consequence of my discussions, and as a consequence of my own opinions on the opening plot, I've come to the firm conclusion that to dismiss this game is to disregard a plethora of incredible content from Final Fantasy. So now to address the elephant in the room, the MMO part of the MMORPG. Before discussing this though, I do want to point out that this MMO part of Final Fantasy XI is ultimately what made so many dismissive of the game's story, and the game as a whole for that matter, to begin with. Because the story was locked behind forced MMO gameplay, ambiguous quest prompts, and party requirements to encourage social play, many people weren't even able to enjoy the story. The 4th Vana'diel census was conducted close to the game's 2nd year anniversary. By this point, there were over 500,000 players, many of which were Japanese, so they had already been playing the game for 2 years. Only 15% of the entire player base was at a sufficient job level on their main job to have beaten the original game's story content. Just to reiterate, less than 15% of Final Fantasy XI players had experienced the main story 2 years after the game's initial release. It didn't get much better either. 4 years after the game's North American launch, only about 26% of players were at a level sufficient to play through the original story. This essentially means that many people who played 11 in its golden era either didn't have the capacity to experience the story, or simply didn't find the need to play through the story. This inaccessible gameplay is what led this game to have the reputation of being underwhelming when compared to the rest of the series. This is what I think, anyway. But what does one do in 11 now? What is the gameplay experience like after 20 years of development? Well, the best word to describe this entire gameplay experience is exploration. This doesn't mean that you spend a lot of time exploring the world, though there is a lot of that. What exactly do you explore? Everything. And I really mean everything. The UI is difficult to get accustomed to, so you're required to explore it for a while and get used to it. The quest prompts are entirely ambiguous, like I've mentioned before. So you have to spend time either exploring the world of Vana'diel, or spend time exploring the wiki guides online. You have to spend time exploring the different guilds in the game to gain access to certain skills like fishing or crafting. Every single aspect of this game requires some form of exploration on the part of the player. This demand for exploration can be a bad thing. There were plenty of times where I simply wanted to do a few things within the game, but it took much longer than it was supposed to, simply because I didn't know how to do it. Overall though, the sense of exploration might be one of the most enjoyable things about the game. The ambiguous quest prompts forced me to keep a wiki guide open at all times, and after I got used to that, I grew to love it. Just to give you an example as to why, I found myself needing to go to Bayado for a mission. While I looked up the walkthrough for that mission, I found a handful of other really interesting quests that also required me to go to Bayado. So I started the mission and all of the related quests, and I went there. While there, I found an interesting looking drop from a mob that I killed, so I looked up the uses for that item. I found said item sells really well at the auction house, so now I can afford all of the maps that I would need for the next few missions. After doing all I needed to do, I would cash out all of the quests and the mission that I started, and I made a simple trip of going to Bayado incredibly productive. The game well rewards the players who take the time to prepare for each of these trips, and while I can see why some people wouldn't like the fact that those missions and quest prompts were ambiguous, the sense of accomplishment you get from exploring the 11 guides and completing all of these things in a single trip was an experience that I haven't felt in many other games. This isn't to take away from actually exploring the game world of Vana'diel though. This world is incredible and is easily the best source of that feeling of exploration. While the maps themselves aren't nearly as exciting as newer open-world games, or zone-based games for that matter, I still found myself enjoying it far more than most other open-world games that I've played. The reason for this is because there is an actual sense of danger in any trip that you take to any location in the game. My first couple of attempted trips to Juneau ended in failure because I got chased and killed by an enemy whose level was way higher than mine. And these enemies simply don't disengage after a couple seconds of running. They will chase you like you killed both of their parents and crashed their funerals, just for the fun of it. The world, again, is dangerous to explore, and the enemies can be quite tough. Most of the exploration rewards the player in the form of a new warp point, and some of them can be really hard to get to. Even after getting summonable mounts where the enemies will no longer attack you, there were still dungeons that either connected a current zone to a new zone, or dungeons within the story that needed to be traversed. The only way to traverse them was to properly prepare for these dungeons. I haven't even mentioned the possibilities of new monsters dropping valuable items for crafting or selling, which made every monster more interesting to fight than it would be otherwise. This game gives you that sense that you're actually going on a real adventure. And even though the zones aren't as exciting, I can't deny that there is a certain charm to them. Where the technical limitations hold the zones back, the art direction certainly makes up for that. The art design is really strong in each of these zones, but the zones themselves truly are a bit outdated. These zones aren't as gregarious in their topography, but I have a hard time disagreeing with the sentiment that the world has a unique charm due to the art direction. From the ominous atmosphere of Qufim Islands to the mysteries of Merifatan Mountains to the epicness of Zarkabard, the world within this game still has a powerful sense of intrigue and identity despite its outdated design. Finally, we come to a topic I've found to be rather contentious, and that is the game's combat. It's very slow. The primary action in combat is to literally select a target, get in range, and that's it. Your character will auto-attack while you do not much. The adjustment curve can be quite harsh on people accustomed to more exciting combat, which in this case is literally almost every other combat system. The combat eventually opens up after you get out of the earlier levels, but up until that point, it is very boring. To start things out, the game does feature a job system that I found to be great. There are 6 starting jobs with 16 advanced jobs that can be unlocked after a certain level. Each job grants passive abilities and stat bonuses that allow for much more effective execution of certain roles in combat. The player also has the freedom to switch between any jobs they want. In addition to switching between jobs, you also have the capacity to choose a sub-job, which gives you the stat bonus and job abilities of the sub-job you choose. There is, however, a catch. Your sub-job must be leveled independently from your main job, and it does have a level cap. The sub-job can only ever be half the level of your primary job. This added a lot of depth to the combat system, and it's one of my favorite parts about the combat. I also wanted to add that each job that I spent time leveling felt very unique even when compared to the jobs that fit within the same archetype. Playing a monk felt very different from playing a Dark Knight, and playing a warrior felt very different from playing a paladin. At the time of writing this script, 11 has more jobs available to the player than does its sequel, 14, and it also gets fewer complaints about a lack of job diversity. I've found that the combat can be boiled down to 3 fundamental and non-mutually exclusive things: cycling through abilities, initiating and building up skill chains and magic bursts, and building a party, which is largely just picking and learning your trusts in most instances. While there is equipment swapping that becomes relevant in the late game, nothing in the original story is sufficiently challenging to encourage that style of gameplay. Firstly, we have cycling through abilities. This can be less exciting than it sounds. Many of these abilities have fairly long cooldowns, so you're only going to be using them once every couple battles. The class I chose to play for most of this story was a warrior, and many of my abilities had to do with buffing myself and the party. I was rather unimpressed with this element of the combat until I got into the more challenging boss fights. During these boss fights, I had to either build strategies that kept the party damage per second up the entire time by staggering my attack buffs, or cycling between heavy attack buffs and using defensive buffs during certain offensive portions of the boss fight, or while the attack buffs were on cooldown. As mentioned before, given how unique each job feels, your experience of this portion of the combat will largely depend on what job you choose, but what I've mentioned thus far has some degree of application to many of the jobs that I spent time leveling. The second thing that one is paying attention to in combat is the skill chain and magic burst system, which I will from here on refer to as the skill burst system. The skill burst system allows additional damage to be dealt to the opponent if the player is able to chain the appropriate weapon skills together in succession with the proper timing. Each weapon skill sets up for a unique skill chain pathway. When executing a skill chain, every appropriate weapon skill after the initial weapon skill will have an associated damage multiplier, and that damage multiplier will depend on the level of the skill chain being performed. There are 3 levels of quality for these skill chains, with level 1 skill chains having the smallest damage multiplier. Where the system really gets interesting, however, is the magic burst component. Every single skill chain has an associated element. If an elemental spell is casted on the opponent being hit by a skill chain, and the element of the spell matches that of the skill chain ends with a magic burst. These magic bursts have massive damage multipliers, so it's optimal to have a mage who can execute these magic bursts if you want an optimal strategy. In addition, when you consider the effects that the other systems have on your skill bursts, such as the passive effects of jobs and the attack buffs of the equipment setups, this skill burst system becomes the second most complicated combat system that I've ever personally seen in a mainline Final Fantasy game, second only to Ignis's combo ender chains from Final Fantasy XV. Knowing which skill chains to use and when will largely be learned through experimentation or by looking it up on an online guide. But learning this skill burst system is strongly recommendable because it makes the impossible battles doable, and it's incredibly satisfying to pull one of these off in battle. While there are other forms of skill chains as well that change up the magic bursting options, most of those will be restricted to late and endgame content. Finally, we have the party building of this game. While this can be done with real people, for a majority of the time, party building will be delegated to choosing trusts for particular battles and memorizing how to properly skill burst with that party. You'll have to memorize which trust will automatically chain with you and which weapon skills of theirs you can react to with your own weapon skills. Experimenting with the trusts and finding out strategies centered on different parties was something else that I really enjoyed, and it complements the skill burst system well from a new player's perspective. And the amount of trusts available in this game is quite comprehensive. Just the starting trust quest in each nation gives you 4 trusts per nation, and considering how your party is limited to 3 trusts at a time, during the beginning of the game anyway, there is a lot of room for unique strategies and experimentation. In terms of this experimentation, if you as a player wanted to try playing with mostly tanks and 1 DPS, you can do that. Do you want to see what kind of skill chains you can pull off with all offensive trusts? You can do that too. Not only is there a lot of diversity in terms of the parties you can build, but there is also a lot of diversity between the trusts of similar archetypes themselves. So one tank won't play the same as another, and the same goes for all of the other various jobs and archetypes. The trusts also behave mostly reasonable too. While there are some idiots that I really don't like to play with, most of the time these trusts will skill burst at the appropriate times, and they are quick to respond to shifts in the battle as well. There were very few times where I was upset with one of the trusts for the sake of their stupidity. I also wish they allowed the player to swap out trusts in combat. Character swapping was present in both Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII, so it was disappointing to see that this isn't an option in this game. Despite these issues, the trust system works fine, and it did allow for some enjoyable experimentation. There is another glaring flaw with this trust system though, and that's the way the trusts are acquired. Trust magic was written in the lore of the game as a form of magic that creates a clone of someone the caster has a deep bond with. This is fine for most instances, where certain trusts are characters you've already gotten to know in the story, but other trusts within the game are characters you've never met before. Despite this, their dialogue reads as though you've already completed their quests. These moments really broke immersion for me because I would go to a brand new character and they would talk to my character like we've already saved Vana'diel together. For long-term players, this isn't an issue because they've already done all of the quests referenced by the various characters. But as a new player, in my opinion, the lore written behind the trust system didn't do anything to add to the experience, so I don't know why they bothered with it. There are some trusts that you acquire without any associated dialogue with the characters, but some of these are just as bad, albeit for gameplay reasons. Many of the best trusts within the game are acquired through a currency the player accumulates called login points, surprisingly through logging into the game on a daily basis. These points can be spent on a plethora of great items, including these trusts. The problem with these, however, is that this shop, where the currency can be spent, isn't static. The things you can buy with these login points change from month to month. Sometimes these trusts are available to buy, and other times they aren't. This means that if you're a new player, the difficulty of the game and the overall experience can drastically be impacted, simply depending on what month you decide to start playing the game. While I think these login campaigns are a good thing for the community overall, I so fundamentally disagree with the decision to make these incredibly helpful trusts available only through these login campaigns. Many long-term players, again, won't see this as an issue because they know the systems inside and out, so the difficulty doesn't change much for them. But for a new player who relies fairly heavily on their trusts, this can make the difference of hours of grinding in order to beat certain bosses. While the trust system is overall a system that makes the game far more incredible and enjoyable, it does have some unfortunate faults. So, is the combat good? Despite having many pros, I can't say that it's a favorite of mine. First of all, because the pace, while appropriate for endgame content, is far too slow for most of the other content. But despite this, it is still an incredible combat system with a lot of depth, and it's not nearly as passive as some people will have you believe. So yes, the combat is really good. Something that surprised me was how many active players there are for this game. I heard that Final Fantasy XI was still surprisingly active from multiple sources. Because of this, I thought I'd run into the occasional player in the world and see a group or two in towns, but since I've started playing the game, I see new players with that new player symbol above their heads almost every time I trek through the cities. There are always a couple players leveling in the leveling zones of this game. Just recently, I ran into a few people in Crawler's Nest while we were trying to get to level 45. We partied up, and we were able to take out the tougher enemies deeper in the zone for more experience than, say, whacking the wasps closer to the entrance. Every once in a while, I decided to do a quest, and coincidentally, there were other players going through the entire quest with me as well. Some of them wanted to form parties while we were doing the quests, while others didn't. But the fact that they are there makes the game feel alive while playing. It certainly isn't as active as many other MMOs, but it isn't dead either. It is a happy medium for players like me who need help from time to time but don't like playing with people. One more thing I wanted to add while in this section is a quick note on the community of Final Fantasy XI outside the game. Two things can be said about the 11 community. It is active and it is incredible. Just to give an example, I was struggling with the final boss of the original story, so I decided to go on the subreddit and ask for help. Within an hour, I had multiple responses on multiple servers from all around the world offering help. It was clear from my post that I literally had nothing to offer, but so many people within the 11 community just wanted to see me enjoy the game. Eventually, I got partied up with someone from halfway around the world, and we beat the boss. The community is truly special. Acts of kindness weren't limited to just this instance, though. There were so many people offering me help throughout my playthrough, and I never once thought that my experience was worsened due to the community. I'm sure there are obtuse people playing the game, but usually those aren't the people you'll interact with, at least not in my experience. Another thing that is often overlooked about this game is the music. It has become a tradition to say that every soundtrack within the Final Fantasy series is underrated. This is something that always annoys me. Maybe they aren't underrated, maybe people are just too quick to carelessly throw that term around. So about Final Fantasy XI's soundtrack, well, it's underrated. I know this sounds a bit obtuse or hypocritical, but if there is a Final Fantasy game with an underrated soundtrack, it is certainly 11. The music quality is great from the very beginning, and it keeps improving, with every expansion coming to a phenomenal crescendo in Seekers of Adulin. I found almost every song within the soundtrack to be both incredibly effective and enjoyable to listen to outside of the game. Few soundtracks have had such an honor, and while it is true that they are more common in the series, that quality certainly is not missing in Final Fantasy XI. The soundtracks are composed by Naoshi Mizuta, Kumi Tanioka, Hidenori Iwazaki, and Nobuo Uematsu himself. Their collective work in this game fit Vana'diel so incredibly well that I had to include this portion in the review. If you haven't had the chance to listen to this music, I strongly recommend it. Finally, we get to the second elephant in this painfully crowded room. Why play Final Fantasy XI when Final Fantasy XIV is out? This is a question that I don't have many answers for. I haven't played 14, I haven't participated in either game's endgame content, and I also am not the biggest fan of MMOs in general. So it's unlikely that I'll give a helpful answer to this question. As a result of this, I did what any self-respecting essayist would do. I went running to Reddit. I conducted lengthy discussions with many players of both games and asked why they prefer one game over the other. The amount of reasons that I got are too numerous to offer a comprehensive articulation on, but I noticed common reasons why some would choose one game over the other. I wanted to talk about these reasons in favor of either game. In addition to this, I also want to discuss why I chose to play 11 rather than 14 as my first MMO. And no, it has nothing to do with the difficulty of purchasing and downloading the game surrounding Endwalker's launch. First of all, why would anyone choose 14 over 11? Well, most people watching this video probably already know. In fact, most people looking into starting 11 seem to actually already know the draw of 14. It has a story whose scale dwarfs that of any other video game. It has 10 years worth of relevant gameplay content, it is accessible and solo-friendly despite doing a fair job at facilitating social play, and most of all, the game is beloved. There are so many people playing and loving the game that its player base hasn't just maintained over the years, but it has dramatically grown. Final Fantasy XIV is the closest thing that a Final Fantasy game has come to a complete package. What could 11 possibly offer to entice players who are considering both games? Well, a lot, actually. For starters, 11 is nothing like 14. They are completely different experiences, so comparing the games in terms of which is better is an impossible endeavor, especially considering the overall quality of both games. The biggest difference that I found people to have mentioned between these two games is that Final Fantasy XI is an intrinsically motivated game, whereas 14 is an extrinsically motivated game. While this isn't the only difference between them, it seems to be one that I had found very often in my discussions. Where Final Fantasy XIV shows players all of the potential points of enjoyment and exploration, 11 gives the player a unique, fascinating world full of opportunities and expects you to find the enjoyment yourself. The quests in 14 are structured, carefully guiding the player along a predetermined pathway, whereas 11 gives you an ambiguous quest prompt and expects you to find your own path to completion, whether that be through an online guide or another player explaining things, or through simply brute forcing your way through exploration. 14 is a theme park MMO, whereas 11 is a sandbox MMO. In 14, you're the famed warrior of light, but in 11, you're some obscure adventurer. There are pros and cons to both of these types of games. Where 14's core experience is highly refined and efficient, 11 is crude and rudimentary. The trade-off of this, however, is that there are parts of 14's world that serves as a barren wasteland of enjoyment, but almost every nook and cranny of the world of Final Fantasy XI has something interesting to offer. Every aspect of 14, from map design to MSQ, helps complement the game's sense of experience. There are a handful of intentional experiences that have been crafted into 14, and these experiences are focused and very well conveyed. Similarly, every aspect of Final Fantasy XI, from map design to missions, help complement the game's sense of adventure. There are a wealth of adventures that can be taken in Vana'diel, none of which are guided, so you get to find out where your journey takes you on your own. This was the sense that I got when looking into both games, and it was what others explained to me in my conversations with them as well. But saying two abstract words, that being experience versus exploration, and using them as an explanation for the differences between these two games might not help much, so let me explain to you what was explained to me. For Final Fantasy XI, the world is incredibly dangerous. You will almost always be at threat of being blocked off from certain achievements due to some superpowered ancient wasp or something. In some cases, there are actual enemies 50 levels higher than the surrounding enemies, which means that leveling your way out of this issue isn't really an option. So it is up to you, the player, to find a way past this. This sort of thing isn't really present in 14. The game's experience is far too streamlined for something unexpected like this to block progress. But the feeling of accomplishment that one gets when gaining access to the warp point behind said powerful enemies isn't really present in 14 either. This difference between experience versus adventure can also be seen in how both games handle gear. In 11, all best-in-slot gear that you can farm for will always be relevant. This is because each best-in-slot piece of gear only maxes out one particular attribute or component in combat. So for a mage, there will be a different set of gear for maximizing your healing abilities, a different set of gear for maximizing damage output, and a different set of gear for magic bursting. That's the gear swapping element that I was talking about in the combat section, by the way. Each of these gear sets need to be farmed individually, so even though this amounts to far more grinding, once obtained, they'll never not be relevant. This is a drastic departure from 14's gearing up process, where the best in slot generally corresponds to literally having the best gear as determined by the number associated with it. Where 11's gear allows for horizontal progression, 14's gearing up is much more vertical. This also carries over into the jobs that you play within the game. In 14, each job only has a handful of optimal strategies. As a consequence, every samurai will play similarly to every other samurai. Every black mage will play similarly to every other black mage. This isn't even remotely the case in 11. Because of the sub-job system, as well as the effects that gear have on strategies, it is rare that you'll ever find two players of the same main job playing that main job similarly. So why play 11 if 14 is out? This question would be like asking, why would anyone read Lord of the Rings when the Mistborn series is out? The question, while earnestly asked, doesn't make a whole lot of sense once you've learned about both games. The proper question to ask is, what does the experience of having played both games give over just playing any single of them? And the simple, albeit convoluted answer is the same as it would be if you asked this same question for any other two good games. For players who think that any one of these experiences are sufficient for them both, they're simply missing out. So, is Final Fantasy XI worth playing? At launch, and for its golden era? I would have to say, absolutely not. I know it was a great game, with incredible experiences if you could play it. But I am one of those people who don't have the time to dedicate to those types of games. But in the modern build of the game, it respects your time, it allows you to forget you're in an MMO, not that you need to, but it does, and it has great content. I'm not going to say that the game is great, but thanks to the changes made to this game, and thanks to its incredible story, thanks to its wonderful gameplay mechanics, I'll go as far as saying that the game is timeless. It offers a sense of exploration that very, very few games can come close to offering. Is this a true Final Fantasy game? While looking at the original story of the game, I fully understand harsh opinions regarding it, but when considering the game as a whole, harsh opinions better have very solid arguments behind them if you want to convince me. The world and the lore of this game is truly top-notch, and the stories build upon the original story content incredibly. That's why the later expansions are heralded as having some of the best stories in the series, not to mention the beautiful and charming world, the incredible depth to the combat system, and the breathtaking music. Finally, is Final Fantasy XI a good Final Fantasy game? Well, saying what I think of this question would be less effective than telling you a story of my experience with it. I've only been playing Final Fantasy XI for close to a month now. I haven't been in Vana'diel for very long, nor have I done a whole lot within the game, comparatively speaking. But as I started listening to the soundtrack for this game while writing the script, I was hit with a heavy sense of nostalgia. I am not one prone to nostalgia. The last game I felt nostalgic for was a game that I played in my early teens. So to have a game experience hit me this way, all I can really say is that while the game isn't perfect, there is something truly special about it. Before ending this video, I wanted to acknowledge a couple people in the Final Fantasy community. The first person I'd like to thank is Isabelle Rose. This was a player that helped me beat the last boss. Because of my current hectic schedule, I wouldn't have been able to make this video if it wasn't for your help, so thank you. Next, I'd like to acknowledge Basic Guardian. It was his retrospective of Final Fantasy XI that got me to finally try the game. I was always on the fence about trying it, but his video picked me up off that fence and threw me into the field of Vana'diel. Finally, I wanted to mention Mike, Kaysen, and Landon from the YouTube channel Resonant Arc. While Landon hasn't been able to be a part of the channel for a little while, I grew up with his content just as much as Mike and Kaysen's. And for those of you who don't know, Resonant Arc is one of the best YouTube channels in existence that centers on storytelling and fictional media in general. Mike is the person responsible for the Final Fantasy reviews on the channel, and they've really shaped the way I look at the series. Mike really dislikes MMOs though, so he never reviewed 11. As a consequence, there has always been a void left in the Final Fantasy conversation regarding this game. While I don't have your analytical skills or video editing competencies, Mike, I decided to try to fill that void that you never had the opportunity to fill. Thank you guys for all of your content as well. And finally, thank you, dear viewer, for watching my video.